Hi, Jared. Welcome to the podcast today. Really excited to have you on.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. It's good to be here.
You've had a really big impact on my trading. I think you're one of the few people in the trading psychology space that kind of takes a more practical, methodical approach to kind of fixing some of the emotional issues. In general, the psychology space is more abstract, more theoretical, and so taking some of the things that you've brought into the trading space with your step-by-step systems has really allowed me to actually take steps in the direction that I wanted to go. And also, I realized that when reading your book, you could replace trading with any type of life circumstance, and like to find out how you got to make a decision that you know you shouldn't have made. It kind of works. It's kind of a fix of your behavior in general. It's just using trading as a mirror to find out where your flaws are.
Yeah, that's very cool that you've been able to utilize it in multiple spheres of life, and specifically in trading. Yeah, that you kind of see the value. I mean, that is a large measure of what kind of got me into this profession, is because in golf, the material was kind of like what it was in trading for a long time, right? Very, very sound, theoretically accurate, good advice. But if it didn't work, you were kind of left to your own devices, and in other words, screwed. And that was me 25 plus years ago, aspiring to be a professional golfer. So to be able to do that for you, and kind of take advantage of the hard work I put in over the years is very cool to hear.
Yeah. So can you talk a bit about how you went from your aspirations as a professional golfer and into becoming a mental game coach for trading?
Yeah. So when I kind of realized the limitations of the golf psychology material to help my own situation, which for context was basically choking under pressure. I was an All-American in college, Division III, won 9 times, but the elite events like trying to play in the U.S. Open, I was choking. At first it wasn't awful, like I played really well, but then it was like kind of choking on the putting green with some short putts. But then it actually started to get worse and affected me elsewhere. So I kind of reasoned that what was happening was deeper, might be personal, wasn't really sure, but at least the tools to kind of dig and figure that out is what therapists are really good at, right? That's their job in large measure. So I got a master's degree in counseling psychology, got licensed. So spent 2 years, 3,200 hours to get licensed as a therapist. And then once I did that, I quit my job, moved to Arizona, and started kind of combining everything I'd learned there. And truthfully, I'd begun doing that before I quit, but kind of combining, sports psychology, golf psychology with what I'd learned to kind of create my own program. And, built up a roster of clients from, everyday golfers to really good juniors to some professionals on the PGA Tour, the LPGA Tour. One gal actually even won shortly after we worked together. But what I had a difficult time was really getting golfers in general to do the work that was necessary. And ironically, I met a poker player who was playing online. This was kind of in the kind of beginnings of online poker booming, 2007. And at the time, he was making around $20,000 to $30,000 a month, playing an average of 12 tables at once.
Wow.
Playing what's called like 5-10 no limit hold'em, which effectively means you're kind of like buying in for $1,000. So he's got, $20,000 to $30,000 spread across these 12 tables, and making an average of that per month. In the 4 months after, so he hired me basically because he was having such intense, insane tilt issues that he would literally grab his desktop computer and just smash it up against the wall. He was punching his monitor, he was breaking his mice, keyboards. I mean, I saw his house, like there was like a pile in the corner of his office of just like broken computer equipment. So that's kind of where we started. And 4 months later, he made about 600 grand in that period.
Wow.
Yes. Right. There's obviously variance in poker, but there's not enough variance that could explain going from making, let's say 80K to 600K. over, comparable 4 month periods. So, a lot of it was he was playing better. He was able to now actually play more tables and play longer. So all of the kind of big metrics had materially changed because the anger had significantly decreased. And that kind of, and he ironically was a named player, fairly well known in the community, and kind of had a platform where he could introduce me to other players, and did so willingly, which is amazing. I mean, most poker players sometimes kind of keep things like this under wraps, but he was quite generous in that regard. So that just kind of opened up the landscape of professional poker, and kind of just took the ball and run with it. To bang my head up against these sort of stubborn golfers who just weren't willing to do the work. In poker, you couldn't just go buy clubs to convince yourself that it's your swing or the clubs, or it was like, look, you got your tactics and you've got your mentality, and either one of those need to improve. If your tactics are good enough, but you're undermining yourself because you're getting so angry, you're getting so fearful, or you're, unmotivated, lacking confidence, undisciplined, whatever, you name it, well, then you kind of have to go to somebody like me. And there were a couple books out prior to that, but, again, I think I kind of brought the same kind of practicality to trading as I did with poker, in part because I knew that I could not BS poker players. I wasn't skilled enough in the game like I was in golf. I had to be able to develop something that was very, very practical and tangible for them, so that they wouldn't think that I was just like some snake oil salesman, which, in poker was fairly commonplace, that people would just kind of come in with these big promises and obviously under deliver. So I wrote The Mental Game of Poker in 2011. And then a couple of years later, traders started picking up the book, saying, you just change the word poker to trading and, everything applies, kind of to your point earlier. And, that kind of began my work coaching traders. And soon after that, kind of landed some institutional gigs. So I've worked with, traders at all levels, all around the world, varying levels of experience, from, beginners to, 30+ year trading veterans. So decent understanding of the industry at this point. And then the trading book came out a little over 2 years ago now.
Crazy. Yeah. And I think changing that word to trading, because I actually bought The Mental Game of Poker, and I didn't get through it because I'm like, I'm not a poker player, but there were some interesting things in there for me. But then once trading came out, even though the concepts were similar, it was like, okay, this resonates with me because this is what I'm trying to do. That your story about poker is interesting because it's very different than golf and trading in many ways, in that when you get aces in poker, like whatever hand you have, you kind of know the math. And so to your point, it's like, it must be there's more evidence of the psychological nature, because it's like, okay, I know the math, but I'm still not performing as I would with a good hand like this. Whereas in golf, it's like you said, there's like, it's my clubs, it's my swing, it's like my hips are tight. There's so many different factors.
Course conditions.
Yeah, course conditions. But to see how powerful it can be in poker, and obviously how powerful it has become in trading, because I know many people personally who have had tremendous results using your system. So it definitely works, but it's just so interesting that it's more of a human thing, and it works in so many different facets of life, and it's because it's about fixing yourself.
Yeah, and the basics that are in both books are human. They're, kind of rules of how we operate. And if you don't understand those rules, then you're naturally going to be trying to operate outside the boundaries of them. And there's a whole host of emotional chaos that can result as a result of that. The most basic is just not understanding that the emotional system has the power to shut down higher brain function, so that, in that time, you might be aware that you should not be, entering into this position, that FOMO has clearly grabbed hold of your perception. You could be aware of that, and like, what you're doing is dumb and you shouldn't do it, and yet you still find a way to click enter. Like, that's an emotional problem. It's not a discipline issue.
Right.
Your emotions have compromised your ability to think clearly. So, if you don't understand that dynamic, then a lot of self-criticism gets layered on top of it. A lot of, loss of confidence can, be a byproduct. You can obviously have a lot of anger, that sort of snowballs and amplifies. But when you understand that, now that doesn't solve it, like, all of your issues, because you still have to understand why it was that you got emotional in the first place. Like, what was driving that? What were the underlying flaws, biases, wishes, illusions that were really driving your emotions to reach that level. But it does remove the extra layers of chaos that get created. And, that's, dynamics that I've seen in all walks of life, right? From, I've got neighbors that want me to write the mental game of parenting, because it's the same thing, right? It's not like,
That's the same.
It wouldn't be a parenting book. Like, I've got one kid, right? Sample size of one. What do I know, right? But I do know how, mentally and emotionally taxing, draining it can be to be a parent. And when you start to see that those dynamics, right? Like, okay, I'm emotionally compromised. That means I'm going to make some pretty bad parenting decisions, on average in that scenario. So yeah, that simple kind of law of human nature,
Yeah.
Needs to be the basis of any system. And I think what and again, trading psychology is not alone in doing this, but a lot of it, kind of it makes it seem too simplistic that, okay, you just need to be aware, right, that this is wrong,
Right.
and here are the corrections to it. But if you're not able to actually apply like a logical correction like that before you become emotional, then you don't have the brain matter to actually be able to consider it, in a reasonable way that could change your emotional state.
Right.
And a lot of times we try to apply corrections to our mentality after we're already emotional. And the part of the brain responsible for emotional control is also shut down at that point. So you don't have as much brain space to think. What you are thinking about is already a little bit tainted and kind of contaminated. It's just a recipe for disaster and making things worse. So a lot of times there is really good advice that could be utilized, but it's so badly mistimed. It's kind of like, you get into a winning position, but like way too late for it to be consistently viable. And that's what ends up happening. So yes, the system that I developed is not based on things that are I think overly complicated, but they're kind of basic laws of human nature, basic laws of how we operate as human beings. And so then, yes, it's applicable in all walks of life. But I think life can be pretty messy. So I like the containment that poker and trading and golf provides, because the feedback is just so much tighter. I mean, even like trading to golf. So if we think about like the cycles with which we go through, one of the most difficult problems is like being able to see and measure progress. So here you read the book, you develop a strategy, you start applying this strategy. How fast are you going to start to see improvement? Well, you can see improvement with a couple weeks, but to really prove the validity of that strategy, you need at least a month or two before, you can start to kind of, as a professional golfer, playing maybe 4 events in a 2-month period, maybe 5, right? Like the cycles are just not
Right.
long enough. Like you might not be in enough, unique situations for us to really know. You could play 4 events, never actually be, having a chance to win in that time period. So it's like, all right, cool. 2 months just went by. You never actually get to test the strategy. In trading, you're going to have a lot of opportunity to test the strategy. So the feedback loops get a lot tighter.
Right.
You can make improvements really fast. And so, yeah, it's more fun to be in environments like this. Same thing in life. I mean, you might not have another argument with a friend for 7-8 months, and then you got to remember what the strategy is at that time. I mean, it's chaotic. So
yeah, there's way more reps here. You're practicing it every single day, every single trade. So something you said in the book and even right now, it was like, it's the awareness that you mentioned in the book, like getting angry about becoming angry. It's like anger is a natural response, but then you notice your anger and then start feeling angry that you're angry, or you're worried and then you're feeling worried about worrying. And it's kind of like the understanding that you're a human being that has these natural instincts and they're going to come up. And so instead of just being upset that you're angry, try to get ahead of it. And it reminded me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Alan Watts, but it's kind of like, he said, it's being surprised that you're angry is kind of like being close to a fire and being surprised that you're warm and trying not to be warm. It's like, that's a response. The warmness is a response. You're not going to fight it. You just have to get ahead of it and don't go too close to the fire. And so I feel like that's similar to your approach, which is like, don't try to fight the anger away. Once it's there, you got to understand the steps that got you there and then try to get ahead of it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's like, so the slight reframe would be like, there's a built-in assumption that being angry is wrong.
Exactly.
And that's what amplifies it. Like, I shouldn't be feeling this way, whether it
Right.
be fear or anger or loss of like whatever it is that you're experiencing shouldn't be happening. And then there, the spiral snowballs. So then, yes, like understanding why you feel that way. Like, what is the nature of this fire? What is the nature of this problem? Is a kind of a mental switch that immediately puts you into problem solving mode.
Right.
Versus like problem eliminating mode. People, by and large, like, you just look at the way people solve problems, and I think my job is really just, an assistant problem solver, right? I'm a hired gun to help you work through problems, and a lot of the book is designed that way. So we look at how people typically look at problems. They see, here's the problem, and they come up with a solution, and that's a bit like trying to get rid of the weed, right? And I've got a lot of weeds in my yard, and like, you just pull it out, like, sucker's going to grow back really, really quickly.
Right.
But if you actually get out the roots, then, it's gone. So by digging down to understand the full nature of it, right? The most simple question you can ask yourself, for those listening now, that can kind of change that perspective and get you problem solving better, is just to ask why. Right? You find yourself getting angry, fearful, FOMO, revengey, whatever it is, ask yourself why. Even in that moment, I mean, you may not have developed a robust strategy here yet, but sometimes just asking yourself, all right, why do I feel this way? Before you enter that trade for the third time in a row after getting stopped out in a very, by one tick, right? Ask yourself, all right, why am I so pissed off? And then write down your answer and see what you come up with. Because it's in those moments where we actually have a lot of raw data that can be utilized to help us better understand what's going on. A lot of the patterning that exists within us, especially within you as a trader, could be charted almost like price action.
Right.
And you've got these indicators, right, that you find to identify opportunities. Well, when you're like kind of writing down the raw details of what's going on in that moment and beginning to problem solve better, you're kind of gathering up the clues that will eventually turn into like reliable indicators that tell you to get the F away from the screen, right? Or to utilize this strategy so you can stay trading, but from a better mental and emotional standpoint.
Right. Awesome. Okay. So I think the first step was, for me at least, was that I noticed, and I think you're one of the very few people that I've seen talk about this, but it's that your emotional behavior, emotional instability can have a technical root and also, or a performance root. And I think most of my like my history with my trading issues was like, okay, it's an emotional issue. And then when I started to learn more about your work, I was like, okay, wait, but why was I second guessing? Was it because I'm a second guesser, or is it because I don't have a clear plan of what to do when I see this? And I realized that a lot of it, I kept just saying, I'm a slow thinker. And so I get flustered, but it wasn't a fluster issue. It was, I don't need to think if I can have a system that tells me what to do when I see this. And then I got rid of that problem, because I was like, when I see this, I will do this. And then I realized it wasn't an emotional thing for me. It was actually a clarity thing. And so I really love that you teach that. So can you talk a bit about how to differentiate between a technical flaw and a performance flaw?
So there are skills that you have to develop, right? I'm skilled enough to know how badly I am, as badly skilled I am as a trader. So just as like I am with in poker, I mean, I will never spend enough time to become as skilled, because I don't love it the way that you all do. Right? I put my extra effort into golf. That's the thing that I still love to do and compete at a high level at. So the raw skills that you have to even understand viable opportunities, right? They're not to be taken for granted. Right? We're not talking about those who are like just copy trading, right? If you are actually becoming a trader, you have a raw skill set, knowledge base that is honed over really years, in addition to your ability to devise a strategy that kind of aligns with who you are as a person, right? Kind of your own unique fingerprint as a human being, as a trader, right? You have that knowledge. So when there are weaknesses in that, which can sometimes be market-based, right? The market has changed. what you've been doing is no longer working in the same way that it should. If you experience some feelings of fear, right, that feeling could actually be a legitimate indicator that there's just some misalignment that is no longer valid. And so if you immediately go to note that fear is psychologically based and personal, or well, then I think you're at risk of certainly of misdiagnosing the problem, but then at risk of like kind of continuing to trade as if nothing has gone wrong, when really you need to kind of take a step back. How do you know that that's the case? Well, so there's the kind of the reactivity that comes from market-based data interacting with your strategy. And then there's the flaws, the biases, the illusions, the wishes that you are bringing into the market. If you don't know which is which at the start, I always say default to technical.
Right.
But that's why you have to kind of write out what's going on in the moment. Because if you recognize that, no, this fear that I'm experiencing is really like, now I'm hesitating on this entry because there's a desire to, not lose this month, that maybe, a month and a half of break even, was fine. Like you were able to handle that, but now it's just becoming a little bit frayed. And you're kind of projecting into the future of like, well, what if this happens for another 6 months? Now all of a sudden, finances are going to get a little bit tighter, and your mind is kind of snowballing in that direction. Like that's clearly a personal, emotional, performance-based issue, but you're not really going to know that until you start to kind of unpack it. So that would be kind of the more advanced version of this. The more basic version is like what happens in the first, 6 to 18 months of being a trader, where there is a lot of systemization that kind of hasn't happened yet, right? There's so much growth. There oftentimes isn't as much consolidation. So sometimes what will happen is, actually maybe a better way of framing this, like, can you articulate the kind of the very basics of your strategy, within 30 seconds?
Right.
And if the answer is no, then any emotional issues that kind of emerge from your execution cannot be ruled out to be not a knowledge-based or a strategy-based error, but a weakness in your understanding of what that is, right? Of your system, of your strategy, of your knowledge. And it's really important to be able to consolidate that, right? You are like a market, right? There's expansion and consolidation. And that consolidation helps to solidify a base of knowledge, a strategy in very clear, direct, objective terms. And then that kind of provides the next launching point for you to grow and expand as a trader. People, traders go through this process all the time. The question is if like you're trying to just optimize things, and if you are, then I think going through those periods, and I would say like every trader by default, like every 3 months, this is a good task to do. Can you still continue to describe the very basics of your strategy like within 30 seconds? And if the answer is no, then it means that there's been some upgrading or evolving that needs to be, kind of reflected. Because again, sometimes those emotions that are like, anger is also one that comes out, right? Like you're frustrated because you feel like you can be getting more out of your trades,
right?
Or you're losing in spots where it's like something just doesn't feel right. But that doesn't have to mean that you hate losing or you hate making mistakes. It could mean that you legitimately recognize that there's opportunity here that you're not utilizing.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So do you think, based on that, do you think that most traders starting out should be a little bit more systematic in their approach? Because then you kind of know that, like, if you know the rules, you're breaking them.
So for newer traders, like, I think if you have like a personality, like a way of thinking that is that, like, I personally would have a very difficult time being really, really specifically rules-based. Like I would likely become a discretionary trader in the way we're describing, just because I understand that my brain like naturally strives for more complexity. But at the same time, like if I don't have like a base of operation, right, then this complexity is like completely lost. But I am also willing to be wrong a lot.
True.
Like, I have no problem just like launching myself in the deep end and swimming out. So obviously in that scenario, you need to have really, really good risk management and
Right.
position sizing to like let me have 18 months of runway where I can learn and invest in that. And so no, I don't think there is like kind of a one size fits all, like this is what new traders need to do. But I do think that the aspiration of defining rules early helps to get that kind of feedback that you're saying. And you know, discretionary style traders have it. They just don't necessarily like forcing themselves to articulate it.
Right.
I feel like that kind of takes away from some of the magic, some of the sensation feel. But in actuality, it does the opposite. That the real great discretionary traders, there's like so much of like a decision tree rule-based system worked out, but they have what's called expert-induced amnesia, where they're so good at it they've forgotten all of it. Like I've seen this attempted to occur, you know, on numerous occasions where they've tried to create algos from their style, and they're so amnesiac about very basic rules, they suck at it, and they tend to make really bad coaches as well, or managers, because there's so much that they're unable to communicate. So yeah, it is there, and if you're a newer trader kind of wanting to establish that, don't shy away from those periods of consolidation where you force it, because another analogy would be like climbing up Everest, right? We've got 2 base camps. You've got to acclimate to the conditions. So that period of consolidation does not take away from your natural ability towards discretion, complexity, intuition, feel. It actually helps to enhance it, and you know, allow you to kind of continue to climb.
Yeah, and so intuition you should trust intuition much more when you have that, when you're in your A game and you have more experience, because I've noticed with myself that when I first started, intuition was just another word for being emotional. It's like, I feel like exiting, I feel like entering. And like in those situations, obviously you shouldn't be trusting your emotion, because you don't have the foundation to make those good decisions.
That's right. Yeah. And that's why I say like 2 to 3 years is kind of the minimum. Like, you can't really have real intuition without a lot of knowledge. There are times where you might see like a very kind of cookie cutter trade. There's just not a lot to it. Then there are times where, again, sometimes that intuition comes up as fear. It comes up as doubt. And if you know that you're in your A game and you're in the zone and you're not a trader who has less than 2 to 3 years of experience, then that intuition is likely either right or guiding you in the right direction in ways that you can't fully articulate. You know, but that feeling and sensation can be very easily contaminated by emotion, which is why if you know you're in your A game, the likelihood of that contamination is very low.
Right.
But a lot of times fear and anger, right, can almost kind of masquerade as intuition and make it feel like, you know, our actions to let a trade run or to close it early are based on intuition, based on some sensation, when it's actually kind of a manipulation and you seeking some protection or some justification.
Can you talk about your inchworm concept and what it means to be in an A game, B game, or a C game?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 parts to this. So one is this like concept of inchworm describes like the way that we improve over time, and that movement looks like the way that an inchworm, and I say that like an actual caterpillar that's a little insect. You know, it's interesting how, you know, nature sometimes helps us to reflect our own nature. So these inchworms kind of like walk like this, and if you kind of look at it, it looks like a bell curve. So bell curve is like a static snapshot of where you are right now. And the most basic way that we would look at that is your A game, B game, and your C game. So you at your best, you at your worst, and then your average. And we're looking on that from a pure execution standpoint. I don't care how much you've made or lost, right? It's like if you've defined your execution to at an A level is X, and you've lost money in that time period, I mean, that's generally how you can know that some variance is involved, because you know that you as a variable, couldn't have been any better at that point. Of course, you can be better in the future, but so you get your A game, your B game, your C game, static snapshot. Now, but the improvement of that over time is how the inchworm walks, which means that your C game has to continually get less crappy, right, in order for your A game to get better. Otherwise, what ends up happening, which is a very, very common phenomenon, is like the gap between your C game and your A game, right, gets wider and wider. And, this happens for a lot of people who deny emotionality, try to control their emotions. Okay. There's a difference between controlling emotions and resolving them, right? Actually solving the causality, like truly correcting the problems that are producing the FOMO, the greed, etc. When you're trying to control your emotions, your C game kind of gets paralyzed in place. And so then you continue to learn, you get better in general as a trader. So your A game continues to advance. And now you've got a big gap between those 2 points. And, a very simple question to ask yourself right now would be, how big is that gap? Like if you think about you at your best, you at your worst, how big is that gap? Right. And if you've got to be really honest about how bad you are when you're bad, right? You can't just kind of like deny it or rationalize it as, it just happens once in a while. Like you blow an account every 3 weeks, you're a, in those prop firm challenges kind of person. You blow an account every 3 weeks, like that, like it doesn't matter how good your A game is, you can't overcome that C game. Now, you're a trader, 4 or 5 years of experience, proven track record, profitable, doing this full time. Your C game is not going to be that bad, but you still have your own C game, which might mean that you succumb to FOMO or greed or fear, and it's costing you in some way, shape, or form. But again, like how big is that gap for those real times when you're at your worst versus when you were at your best? And if as that gap gets wider and wider, it gets harder and harder for you to be at your best. It takes more and more energy. You're more liable to burn out, more consistently. So like, the end of the weeks get really tough. Traders like this will tend to actually perform their worst on Thursdays and Fridays because they're just more drained.
Yeah.
There's a decision fatigue element here, right? Just like being in front of the charts for hours a day. Even if you're not taking a trade, you're making hundreds of decisions to not enter trades, right? There's hundreds of calculations that are going on. So decision fatigue becomes an issue, and it just becomes easier and easier for you to perform poorly at that time. And then ultimately, right, when you are emotional, those emotions tend to come out in larger form and tend to feel more irrational, feel more illogical, feel like they're just like so out of line with how you normally see yourself. And all of that is true. So, but the answer is not to keep, developing new systems and strategies on a technical side, right? That's already very strong. Now it's like time to turn and look towards the mental and emotional improvement, because when you're in your A game, your mental and emotional system is operating at its peak or close to it. When you're in your C game, the opposite is true. And so any technical mistakes that you make are not generally a result of technical weaknesses, right? You already know enough there.
Right.
What you are unable to is to access that knowledge, access those skills and those decisions because of how compromised your mind is, how emotional you are. So you've got to correct that side in order to kind of unlock the C game and get that inchworm progressing so your A game can get better, because that's ultimately what we want. Year over year, if your C game is not any better than it was a year ago and your A game is not any better than it was a year ago, then you've made really no progress. Maybe it's happening more frequently or less frequently, but like year over year, you want to be able to say that your C game is measurably better than it was the year before, and the same with your A game. And that means that you're truly progressing and not just like, kind of going through the motions and, stagnating, plateauing in a sense.
Yeah. And so for the C game, it's like, that's where you make your biggest mistakes. And it seems like the tendency is like, oh, I have a a batch of winning trades. Let me see how I can make an extra 0.2R on the best trades. And realistically, if you just go to find the worst trades and eliminate one or two of those ones, then you make way more progress. So would you say that if a trader has an opportunity to work on their A game or their C game, what should be the first thing that they do?
So, yeah, I think far rarer are the traders that have like too narrow of a range. So sometimes you're going to say like, oh, well, I actually don't really have much of an A game or a C game. It's just like, I just go trade. You're either like incredibly systematized where like you probably could actually create an algo for what you do.
Right.
Or you're like a highly perfectionistic trader who has a lot of fear and has like kind of artificially capped your A game. Now, if you are in that style, then like it's actually a C game issue.
Right.
That's kind of paralyzing the front end progression. And so you want to work through that. But yeah, I mean, the beginnings of like improving your C game is really the beginning of kind of entering my system, which is like at the beginning, you have to get a good map, very good details, very good descriptions, and an understanding of what is actually happening around the biggest mistakes that you're making. And so, you know, this is freely available on my website. You know, you can download this worksheet called a data collection worksheet, which basically has you detailing the thoughts, the emotions, the behaviors, the physical signs, the changes in your perception of the market or your positions, and detailing that out around your biggest mistakes or in the kind of the lead up to it. And as you do that more and more regularly, you're going to start to see some patterning, right? This is the beginning of you kind of charting your emotions, much like you would see some price action. And so as you kind of look at that data, you can start to scale it and understand the early warning signs that exist prior to that mistake. The mistake doesn't come out of nowhere. If it does, that's evidence that there's what's called accumulated emotion, right? If you go from 0 to making a really bad decision, that is 100% caused by accumulated emotion, meaning that the past losses, mistakes, failures, you know, instances of FOMO, you know, like the emotions that build up over time can oftentimes like automatically get triggered in a moment and instantly kind of flood your mind.
Right.
That's really the kind of the only instance where you're not going to have any early warning signs. Otherwise, for most traders in many situations, their awareness of the problem is not evident until after you've already made the mistake, right? You already drove the car off the cliff and you realize in midair, damn, that was dumb, right? We want you to see the road signs, you know, yards, miles ahead that tell you, hey, the bridge is gone, so turn around. You know, and that kind of deviation is something you have to construct, right? You have to go through and gather up these details, put it into order of severity, so you can see those early warning signs because they are there, but many traders just haven't spent the time to actually look at them, chart them, and use them to prevent themselves from making some pretty dumb mistakes.
So can you kind of map out like a general idea of what that would look like for a trader, for example, who like they know they should take a loss, but they can't, or that, you know, they're a day trader and they've been waiting 3 hours for a trade. And it's kind of like, you know, when you go to the fridge and you open it and there's nothing there for you and you come back 10 minutes later, you kind of lower your threshold of what you're willing to eat. And now there's something for you. So that kind of stuff happens. So for those situations where like, you know, you shouldn't be taking a trade, but now you haven't taken a trade in a while and you just feel a little bit antsy. How can someone go from like, okay, like you just conclude that, you know, I got impatient, but how do you go back and map that to actually get ahead of it?
So you just start kind of asking yourself the question of like, all right, well, here was the mistake. Let's just say like at 3 p.m. today was when I took that trade, as you know, to use your example. What was going on at 2 o'clock, right? And that, so like, you're just kind of asking yourself the question, like, what was going on before? So for example, the itchiness to take a trade may take the form of looking at symbols you wouldn't normally look at, right? Opening up charts, changing time frames, like there's clearly like a deviation in your behavior that is different than when you're at your best.
Right.
And so, yes, you haven't made any mistakes yet, but the fact that you're doing that means that you're not in the right frame of mind.
Right.
And so those become like the early warning signs. And then we go back to like, okay, like at noon, right? Maybe you took just prior to that, you had a trade lose, and you have no problem handling losses, provided that you get opportunities to rectify it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So we could even say that that first loss actually was the early warning sign, right? Because rationally you can handle the loss, but emotionally you actually can't. It's not as pure as you think it is.
Right.
Right. You've got more breathing room than like some traders, they lose one trade and they're angry.
Mhm.
Right. Now they're not like raging, but like they're already itchy. It's like palatable and there's a deviation from optimal. But for you, it's more subtle. You got more breathing room. You have more opportunity. And if the next trade comes and it wins, all is good. You're relaxed. You're kind of back to optimal.
Right.
But the point is that like you're being dishonest with yourself and saying that that first loss is not affecting you. It's not affecting you yet. But if it leads to that itchiness to want to rectify it, what's clearly there. So now we've got like, all right, taking a loss would be like the early warning sign. Then it's the like looking at, charts that you wouldn't normally, not maybe, let's say, taking a break. I think a lot of traders need to take more breaks throughout the day than they typically do. And let's say normally at 12:30, you would leave for 5 minutes to grab lunch, but subconsciously you're expecting to have had an opportunity to rectify that mistake. So you start delaying the time that you're going to go eat to make sure that you're not going to miss something. Like, so there's the deviation that those are the kinds of very subtle things that we're looking for that are not causal, right? That's the whole point. That you skipping lunch or you looking at those other charts is not causing you to then take a suboptimal trade. It's instead the opposite. It's an indication that you're already emotionally compromised.
Right.
And you can't really see it. So we're just trying to kind of connect the emotion with certain signals that indicate problem before you would typically recognize it as one, which is right when you actually make the mistake. And that's far too risky in my mind to, it's like, all right, I'm going to stop the car right before the road ends. Like that's not going to happen every time.
Yeah, that delaying lunch analogy that got me. That stuck. That's me. That's me for sure. There's two things I want to discuss about this example. So that first moment when you're early in the day, you're good, you're feeling good, and your entry's there, and the market kind of comes, bounces above your entry, and it doesn't fill you, and it goes without you, and you're like, yeah, it's all good. There are many opportunities. But deep down, there's a little bit of resentment, a little bit of being upset. And then that's when the emotional snowball starts to go. When you notice that in yourself, like, hey, you know what? I feel like if you're just honest with yourself, you're like, that bothered me. I feel a little bit off about it. The two things are, one is, what do you do? Is there a real-time concurrent process that you can do to kind of resolve this emotion before it gets too snowball? And the second one is saying, I know there's variance in the market, and I know there'll be another trade. But do you really know that? How do you really know that so much that you believe it? Instead of just saying like, you can let the trade go, there'll be another trade. And that seems good in your head, but that's different than someone who really believes it and is not going to rush into any other trade. So can you talk to those two things? I can repeat them if you.
No, yes, right. So the second one first, because that kind of connects back to the trading psychology material that's out there. Like Trading in the Zone, like every new trader should read that book. Like my book is not going to give you what a lot of that book does, which is help you to understand the realities of trading. So
Right.
what you're saying there is like, look, if your strategy produces, more than one signal, a month, like you can be pretty reliably that, there's going to be more opportunities today or, in the near future. So that is factually true. But like understanding that is not necessarily a psychological principle, but it's kind of like the technical improvements you need to make that we were talking about earlier, right? That you're understanding the landscape of this performance environment and the realities of it. And so for the newer traders, yeah, there is a bit of a training effect that has to occur. There has to be some consolidation with that knowledge, and injecting that idea into that moment is how you train that. Now, you could prepare yourself ahead of time, sure. You can review afterwards and just like, all right, cool, look, here's proof. There were additional trades that came up throughout the day. Like, okay, cool, validation. You do that day after day after day. But in the moment, when the emotions are rising and you have an idea that can kind of help to correct it, in this case, not something deeply personal, but instead knowledge of the performance environment that didn't exist because you came from, I was talking earlier to somebody who's a soccer player. Okay, soccer and trading, a lot of difference in variance. Like, we know that there's a decent amount of variance that comes from officials that, for better or for worse, is real. But point is, right, that performance environment does not align with trading in this way. So there's knowledge that has to get consolidated and internalized. And so, yeah, doing that in the moment is how you start to upgrade and remove that level of emotionality. But now, if we look at, all right, here's the situation, but it's actually a bit more, of a performance flaw on my part, right? I don't like when I get unlucky, right? The fact that I didn't get filled, like, F you market, like, you shouldn't do this to me. There could be a little bit of entitlement in here, or there could just be a little bit of just like hating variance, hating luck.
Right.
And so how do we correct that side of it? You can't rationalize your way around it. You have to instead kind of unpack it and really understand the nature of why it is that you hate variance. So there's a tool that I talk about in the book, and again, another worksheet on my website, called the mental hand history. Okay, don't get hung up on the term. It just comes from poker. But the point is, it's just like a problem-solving process, okay? And so in that process, we are trying to dig into the roots to understand why you would hate luck. Now, a common example is the illusion of control, or the wish for control. You hate luck because you want to have more control over your results than is real. And luck and variance is like colliding with that belief. And so you have to then, kind of reaffirm the things that you ultimately have control of and what you don't have control of. And so in that moment, you are injecting the logic that says, look, this is going to happen. This is going to happen regularly. This is part of trading. I do not have control over this. Okay. Here's what I do have control over: my next trade, my next actions, my ability to work through my emotions. Right. And that's the kind of massaging that you're talking about. And if you are able to kind of inject that logic early enough, right, before your mind gets too compromised, it will have an effect, assuming that is actually the root of the problem. Right. That injection of logic is, another part of the system. It's not about like having a mantra, right? Something that's like sounds good in theory. But again, that's where a lot of the trading psychology material falls short, is like a lot of it is very logical, but is it surgical? Can you surgically apply this logic into this moment? And if you can't, because it's not kind of getting to the underlying flaw, it's getting to maybe more of the theoretical side of it for newer traders, but you've got to get surgical into the, like, why are you rejecting? And it's a lot of times flaws like that. So other flaws would include confirmation bias or hindsight bias, right? The hindsight bias might pop up in there, like, oh damn, like I should have had my target like a little bit early, or my entry a little bit earlier, so that I would have gotten proper fill. Well, that's an illusion. High expectations, the illusion of emotional control, like these are just examples of underlying flaws that are oftentimes at the root of this. And the book I talk about, I think, over 40 of them. So there's a lot.
Yeah, and they're all a little bit nuanced. So like you can notice that one is not exactly like the other, and you can find yourself in some area of that book that that'll resonate with each trader, I think. So if once you feel something in a moment, is that now your responsibility before it gets too intense to then inject the logic statement and say, like, is that where the mental hand history would come in real time to be like, remember, this is what you believe, and this is why it's flawed to believe that, and this is why, like, to convince yourself in that moment with logic that there will be more opportunities, or that variance is part of the game. Is that where that would come in right at that moment?
So the mental history is something you construct in advance,
Right,
go through in advance, and you define what that injection of logic is going to be in advance.
right,
You train it and you review it so that it becomes solid in your mind, so that in the moment, then
right.
it can have kind of some potency to it. Otherwise, you may not believe it, because if you're kind of trying to spontaneously
Yes.
read it then or remember, you're relying on your memory, which can be a little fuzzy at that time.
Yeah, so it's written not during market hours, but then now that you have a sound logical argument against your expectations and beliefs that come up spontaneously during the market, during the day, now you have this thing that you've written as your rational self, not during an emotional time, and that you know that, hey, I know this is true because I wrote it when I was of sound mind. And then that's what you're saying, you can massage it in surgically as you feel those things, and then that will slowly change your expectations and beliefs.
Yeah. So in the moment, we hope for an immediate, like, kind of shift in your emotional perspective, in your emotions, like become a little bit more rational. But the need and the necessity to keep doing that again and again and again is going to come, because you do it once doesn't mean that the problem is solved.
Right.
So I use this analogy in the book. It's like it is a lot like chopping down a tree with an axe. Right. So the logic and the sharpness of that logic defines like how sharp that blade is. Right. So the more you train it, right, that blade gets sharper. Otherwise, if it's not really that well prepared, you kind of fuzzy. It's like the axe is just going to ding off the bark of the tree.
Right.
But finally get something that's solid, right? You can chip away at it, chip away at it, chip away at it. And for some people, it's a big freaking tree. It's going to take a while to be able to chop down, and you might have to continue to utilize it throughout the trading day. And it might actually produce more accumulated emotion throughout the day, where, fatigue and that accumulation means that while you've been able to be in control of FOMO or revenge trading, throughout the day, come the last hour, maybe you're actually at the greatest risk of failure.
Right.
And that might feel like a regression, but it's actually a sign of progress.
Right.
And a sign that you just got to keep working this system. And in this case, be more aware of the potential risk, and maybe, kind of end your trading earlier, or take more breaks throughout the day to make sure you're reducing that accumulated emotion, or maintaining your, kind of energy.
Right. And you mentioned breaks a couple of times, saying that you think traders should take more of them throughout the day. You also talked about meditation. Can you talk about how meditation and then going for a walk, taking breaks, what role they play and what role they don't play? Because I think some people overestimate the power of meditation in terms of how it can actually resolve issues. So can you talk about those two and how they play a role?
Yeah. I mean, meditation, I think, is misapplied when it's viewed as a solution.
Right.
It's, I think, more of a tool to build kind of mental strength, to create more mental space. But sometimes it can be used as a suppressive element, right, as an antidote to emotion, when really we want it to be used as an element to help understand and dig into and train your mind. If you're walking around with a rock in your shoe and it hurts, we wouldn't want to use meditation to make you more comfortable with that pain.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I think a lot of people end up doing with that. And just in general, like they're in a lot of emotional pain and are just trying to block it out and numb it and deal with it in ways that are, I think, ineffective in the long term for maximizing performance. So yeah, I mean, breaks throughout the day, I think it'd be 30 seconds. I mean, it doesn't have to be that long. It's just enough to make sure that you're not just kind of glued here, because
right,
there is a degree of fatigue that exists just from being there, right? This is an intense environment.
Right.
Like NBA players don't play 8-hour games.
Yeah.
Right. Golf is an intense sport, because, like the US Open that happened last weekend, these guys are playing 5.5-hour rounds. Just that fact alone right, is tough. There's an endurance component to it, and in fact, like, trading is kind of like an endurance athlete. just like more from a mental standpoint. So I think most traders tend to not be as well trained as they are expecting themselves to be. They think that just being there often enough allows that training to be at a high level. And yeah, it doesn't mean that you're weak, but the regular breaks are necessary, even for a minute or two, to just give yourself a chance to kind of reset and refresh. But then, yeah, I mean, I think if there are more quiet times in the market, like it'd be cool if you could just set some alerts,
Right.
you know, even if they're kind of well in advance of, you know, of your potential entries, and like turn off the monitors or go do something else, do something, you know, for 5-10 minutes. You don't have to wait until the next alert. I'm just saying, like, give yourself the opportunity to like have like a legit 10-minute break where you can kind of decompress. It will allow you to be more emotionally stable and kind of capable of responding to real emotions that do come up. Not to mention that, you know, it's going to be easier to be in your A game.
Awesome. Do you have time for one short question, or you got to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I was going to say that there's a lot of talk about, and I say this all the time, to focus on the process. And I say that, but then I notice that my attention is on outcome. So what does it actually mean to focus on the process? What are some things that are process oriented? And you mentioned this in the book, but some things that are process oriented that traders can actually measure and track over time to make sure that their focus stays on that process.
If you say focus on the process in a way that is kind of empty, like without like a means to actually be able to do it, then you're actually taking a results oriented mentality towards becoming process oriented. Right? You only care about the result, which is being process oriented. You don't care about the process of becoming more process oriented.
Right.
And it's a common phenomenon, right? But it sort of shows you the missing piece here. And so, like, how do you become more process oriented? At a basic level, you have to find better ways to get feedback. Results in trading matter, right? Your P&L matters, right? The question is like time frame. So in the short term, we tend to kind of default to using that as a feedback mechanism for how we're performing.
Right.
And that's where the A to C game analysis comes in, right? Defining kind of that inchworm of like, what is your A game? What is your B game? What is your C game? From your own performance standpoint, but also from a technical standpoint. Like, can you grade your trades in a sense? Can you grade your execution? And if you can, then that becomes the form of feedback that you are focused more on in the short term, day to day. Long term, I don't care if you perform perfectly. If you've lost money over 6 months, like, there's something that is severely wrong. Okay. Unless you're a new trader and you're actually losing less. But the point is, like, to become more process oriented, you need a lot of feedback that gives you indications of how you're performing, how you're growing, how you're improving. And results are just not a very good, reliable way of doing that. So you've got to create your own metrics by which you're measured. Like any like process piece of, like, let's say I want to have more emotional balance. I want to be more patient throughout the day, and you know, on sideways moving markets, like, be able to sit in my hands properly. Like, that's a process oriented goal.
Right.
But if you take a results oriented mentality to that, then you're saying just do that without understanding how you're going to actually develop that skill.
Right.
And I think that's the piece that you want to look at. So yeah, the simple way to do it would be define what those, like, you can kind of break it out like this. Define the result goals that you want, right? I want to make $10,000 a month. I want to make $50,000 a month, whatever it is, I don't care. Then the question is, like, how are you going to do that? And the how you do that is the process piece. It could be, you know, I need to take X number of trades per month, and I need these trades to be of X degree of quality, right? A little variability in terms of, you know, but I can obviously have no C game trades.
Right.
Okay. Well, how are you then going to do that? So I think it's kind of like 2 layers. So what's the result goal? How are you going to get that result goal? And then, like, what's the plan for you to actually be able to develop those skills or execute in the way that we've just described? So that's that's kind of how you become more process oriented, right? That if we make that a result goal in a sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Awesome. Okay. And if anyone wants to learn more about you and more about your work, where can they find you? What can they do to learn more about this stuff and your philosophies?
So website's a great spot, kind of the one-stop shop, jaredtendler.com. As I mentioned, the free worksheets that are widely available, and they are, they work kind of in concert with the book. The book you can get in ebook, audiobook, softcover, hardcover, pretty much anywhere you buy books, it's around. And then also on the website, I have this trading psychology masterclass, which is but I think we have like close to 13, 14 hours of material that, combine kind of workshop. So, if you want help kind of being guided through the process to develop a mental game strategy, utilize all the tools. There's a combination of both kind of theory. So if you're not super familiar with the book, it kind of gives you cliff notes. If you are familiar, it gives you good repetition. But then a majority of it is me actually reviewing real traders' worksheets and kind of helping to problem solve a lot of the different sticky points that they get in, kind of in bringing the book to life in some way, but also, walking them through the process of again, kind of developing that strategy and all the tools and elements that make it up.
Awesome. Okay, I'll leave a link to the website on this video in the description. Really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate your time. I know people will get a lot of value from it. So thanks so much, Jared. Appreciate it.
Good to meet you. Take care.